And welcome to another edition of Media Watch. I'm your co-host, Eric Tate.
I'm Raymond Peterson.
I'm Bob Anthony.
Alan Singer.
Historian Dr. Alan Singer, and with us is longtime friend, colleague, and legal expert, Warren J. Bennia. Do I have that name correct, Warren?
Yes, you do, Eric, and thank you for the introduction.
Appreciate you being here because we're going to try to get your legal expertise on all the craziness that's been going down the pike, thanks to the guy in the Oval Office and all his myriad numbers of executive orders that has totally turned the country and actually the globe upside down. And so we're doing this the Wednesday before our normal Monday airing on Manhattan Neighborhood Network.
March 26th.
Being brought to you, thank you, Raymond, March, the 26th of March. Manhattan Neighborhood Network is where we would air normally. We go up on YouTube, and it's being brought to you by EBT Educational Productions and Zoom's technical expertise. And so we discussed ahead of time some of the topics. So let's just kick off and we'll go piece by piece. One of the key things, the executive orders that we've been hit with, the first one that really roiled folks up was the birthright citizenship ban that basically upended hundreds of years of precedent and seems to be in violation of the 14th Amendment. Warren, basically, as a legal expert, what grounds does he have for that?
Well, I haven't read their briefs, but I really can't fathom the argument that would support ending birthright citizenship since it's in the Constitution. And it would seem that the predicate to ending birthright citizenship should be an amendment to the Constitution. So an executive order wouldn't do it because it would be contrary to the Constitution.
Right.
And so the lawsuits have been challenging the executive order attempting to do it as unconstitutional. And it seems there's a lot of merit to the legal action.
Absolutely. But what I was going to say, the Constitution makes it very clear that a person born on U.S. soil, regardless of the immigration or not, regardless of the status of the parents, if you're born on U.S. soil and subject to its laws, you are a U.S. citizen. And the Constitution does make that very clear.
This was the 14th Amendment. It was passed in 1868 after the Civil War. And this was done because after the Civil War, the southern states were trying to block the citizenship rights of formerly enslaved blacks. So in order for those states to return to the Union, they had to accept that all persons, including formerly enslaved persons, who were born in the United States were citizens. And that's the origin of this. The other thing that's so important about this is that you look at Europe and people are German, people are French, people are Spanish. And those are really originally ethnic nations. But the United States was never an ethnic nation. The United States was always a very diverse nation, and you became an American by becoming a citizen. And what this did is it made it very, very clear we're all Americans if we were born here or if we were nationalized, no matter our race, our ethnicity, our religion. This is a fundamental part of what it means to the United States.
Yeah, the question for me is the wording says, I remember because I was born in the Panama Canal Zone and they were talking about U.S. citizen birthright by birth in the country or its territories and possessions and subject to its laws and jurisdiction of the United States. Now, this caveat that they're trying, this Q twist that they're trying to put is this subject to its laws and jurisdiction. Warren, what's your take on that twist that they're trying to push? They're saying that you're not a citizen and you're here illegally, so you're not subject to the country's laws and jurisdiction. Parse that for us.
Well, it it doesn't speak to the birth of the child. So, and if you heard Alan clearly, and you reflect back on the history that he's discussing, um, those previously enslaved individuals were forced immigrants who had children on the land of the United States. And it was clearly the intent to make all those individuals citizens of the United States. So it's a difficult argument to make in the sense that you're trying to deport them on the basis of the laws that they're not subject to.
That's interesting.
So
Well-
it's a bit of a tautology.
Yeah.
So I don't think it'll fly, to put it in simple terms.
Now, look, Eric, I don't know about you and Bob and Ray, I've gotten a few traffic tickets. So I'm clearly subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. And what this refers to is to the families of ambassadors, people, consulate officials, people who are extraterritorial because they represent other governments. And that's what that refers to. Then if you are an ambassador from Great Britain, you're not subject to the laws of the United States. If you break a law, you could be expelled, but you can't be held responsible. Those are the people who are not subject to the jurisdiction. But anybody with a traffic ticket is.
Yeah. But the other side of that coin I was going to mention is because they have diplomatic immunity also.
Yeah.
Yes. So, but the children of those forced immigrants, to go back to your point, Warren, if the parents of those children and those children said, well, I'm not subject to your laws, then you don't own me, and so I'm going to walk away. So they were evidently subject to the laws of coercion and the laws of the state of South Carolina and the laws of all those slave-holding territories. So how could they not be subject to the laws and jurisdiction?
Yeah, there were all the Fugitive Slave Acts. I mean, it's obvious, you can't have it both ways.
Have it both ways. So that gets us to the whole deportation part, because a number of these other lawsuits are really about, they don't like what you had to say, they don't like what you were doing. Talk to us, Bob, about the two cases, or maybe three now, about these folks that were demonstrators or led demonstrations that were snatched up without due process, et cetera. Where are those cases, and see if Warren can give us an interpretation of the battle between the courts and Trump.
Well, I've tried to keep up with the case of Mahmoud Khalil, the first case that we had, where he was literally pulled out of his, and he's a Palestinian. He had participated in the Palestinian protests on Columbia's campus, for the sake of the viewers, and he was ripped out of his own home, taken to Louisiana to the federal lockup there, and he's been there ever since. A judge apparently ruled that this case needs to come back to New Jersey, and but he's still locked up in Louisiana. And if I remembered right, Warren, a 3-judge panel just heard the case, and one of the judges, well, in any case, he's still locked up. I don't want to get into too much detail. He's still locked up in Louisiana. And there's another case of a Columbia student, a female. She's been a citizen here since she was 7.
No, a resident, a legal green card. She's not a citizen.
Not a citizen, legal green card since 7.
He was
Okay,
a permanent resident since
7. And she was arrested once in a Barnard protest, a pro-Palestinian protest, and ICE came looking for her, but she luckily sued first, and so she has a layer of legal protection ahead of her, and her whereabouts right now are unknown intentionally, because ICE is still looking for her. They're looking to deport her as well. And the third case, I believe, is a student who self-deported to basically save herself from ICE. So we have people expressing their opinions on the Columbia campus being deported, frankly, because of what they said on campus. And ICE is trying to, and the Trump administration is trying to say that they did otherwise. They're trying to say that Mahmoud Khalil forgot to list certain items on his original visa request, that people that he worked for. But it's, as Warren said, the fabric of these charges seem very thin.
Here's,
Yet here we are.
here's my question about the law. And Alan, you can give some background before we go to Warren on the legality. The alien whatever law of 1798 is the law that they dreamt up to come after Khalil, correct?
There
And
are
so-
two laws they've been using.
Right, so-
Alien Enemies Act, yes.
Yeah,
and
against
so
Khalil,
here's the thing.
they used
The
uh,
Aliens and Sedition Acts that were passed right after the Revolutionary War.
no, that one is the one they used
Were
against
so
the
egregious.
Venezuelans.
Let me finish. They were so egregious that the country actually realized that this was antithetical to why they had revolted against the crown. And so they immediately, right after they passed those laws, they rescinded them. This 1798 law, alien whatever law, stayed on the books. And they use it in a time of war as a way to make sure they don't have enemy agents amongst them. So go ahead, Alan. Tell us the difference between that 1798, the war thing, and where we are legally.
There are two different laws. The 1798 law is called the Aliens Enemy Act.
Mhm.
That was actually used to intern Japanese during World War II.
Yeah, I was
One
gonna
of the
ask.
worst moments in US history. That's the act that was used against the Venezuelans. They argued that the Venezuelans were part of a gang making war on the United States. However, that also violates the 14th Amendment, because the 14th Amendment offers due process to all persons, and those Venezuelans were denied due process. What the issue with Khalil is they're claiming he violated the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952.
That's the new charge.
Yes, that
That's the new
act
charge. Yeah.
empowered the Secretary of State to say that somebody is putting the United States in a bad light and could be thrown out. And that was originally passed to go after communists in the United States during the Cold War. But there's a very funny twist on the 1952 Act. In 1996, there was a case where it was called the Massimo versus Reno case. And what happened is there was an effort to expel Massimo, and a judge threw out the case against Massimo, saying that the 52 Act was unconstitutional because it was excessively broad and it was ex post facto, meaning the Secretary of State could say what you did before, even though we hadn't codified it, embarrassed the United States. And ex post facto laws were illegal. Now, the irony is the judge who declared the 52 law unconstitutional, her name was Judge Marianne
Trump.
Barry, but her maiden name was Trump, and she was Trump's older sister.
No.
Now, the law did not make it to the her ruling didn't make it to the Supreme Court because it was thrown out of a jurisdictional issue. But her argument that, one, it is so vague that you can't defend yourself, and two, it's an ex post facto ruling because they're declaring something today illegal that you did before. And this is eventually going to end up in a Supreme Court. But Warren, you know the legal process better than me. That's the history.
Well, the basic foundation is that there is an existing scheme of immigration and naturalization laws that contain a component for deportation and due process. And you start with the fundamental principle of due process. And if due process applies, there should not be deportations taking place where there is a fabricated allegation of violations of national security or being in the interest of national security. And the question that the judges are posing, basically, give us evidence-based reasons why the existing laws are not being complied with and people are being rounded up and immediately deported from the country, and in particular to El Salvador. The Alien Enemies Act, which Alan described the history of, which is used in the case of the Venezuelan gangs, there's no evidentiary showing of one gang membership with regard to each individual before deportation. There's yet to be established a link between government authorization of the gangs on the part of Venezuela to establish a link that would allow for the Alien Enemies Act to come into play, where Venezuela could be construed as a country that's an enemy of the United States. You can have disagreement of policy and not necessarily be an enemy.
Mhm.
So the Alien Enemies Act was utilized only with regard to the War of 1812, World War I, World War II. And in the context of World War II, a famous Supreme Court case arose called the Korematsu case, which attacked the internment of Japanese citizens. And eventually, the Korematsu case law was overturned by Judge Roberts. Ironically, you could say as dicta in the cases challenging the Muslim bans in 2018, where Judge Roberts, originally Trump had issued orders banning Muslims.
Yeah.
And then the orders were amended to ban countries from which predominantly Muslims came from. Interestingly, Roberts upheld some of those orders, but went out of his way to overrule Korematsu, which eventually resulted in reparations for the descendants of the Japanese individuals who were interred. So the simple principle is, what's the factual basis to support the alleged circumstances that would allow for the deportation of individuals who would be entitled to the statutorily established procedures to comply with due process before being deported from the country?
Now, Warren, I actually took a look at the 1798 law, and it actually has provisions in it for those who are not charged with hostility, but are somehow connected or identified as enemies, to provide enough time to settle their affairs before they're taken out of the country. There's actually provisions within the law for the judges to get involved. I mean, it was actually written with provisions for due process to take place. Yet all of the 1798 law, yet all of that seems to have been ignored.
And that's the key point, a lack of process before implementation. And also in the case of Judge, if I pronounce his name correctly, Bogesbert, who issued an order telling the planes to turn around, there's still a factual hearing going on with regard to whether there was knowledge that the order was in place either before the flights took off, while the flights were in the air, or when the flights landed. And there is the question whether every individual on those planes was actually a gang member.
Yeah.
There's the allegation that some individuals or a individual just happened to have a tattoo and had nothing to do with a gang.
And Warren, if I understand it right, the administration is trying to use a state secrets defense?
With regard to the refusal to comply with the request of the provision of factual information that would be the predicate for complying with the Alien Enemies Act. And so, yes,
Yeah.
The national security now the thing about allegations of national security. Um, I, I once tried a case where the government was alleging that national security justified its actions with regard to the defendant in the case. And we actually won the case because when on cross-examination and in response to discovery, they were unable to produce factual information that could be viewed by the judge who had security clearance, which makes it even more curious as to why information that's requested cannot be provided when it can be viewed in chambers and be viewed by a federal judge who has a security clearance.
Mhm.
It makes you wonder about whether there is such factual predicate that can be produced in response to discovery request or direct orders from the judge.
Yes, and basically what they're trying to do, as you alluded to, Bob, is rush all these individuals before they have a chance to go before a judge to have them prove their charges are correct. And so that's why they snatch these people up in the dead of night, whisk them off to someplace where nobody knows where they are, and or send planes out. And when the judge says turn the planes around, they don't comply with the judge's order. And now the judge is, as you said, Warren, totally pissed. And so he says, prove to me you weren't just violating my order to violate my order. What happens if the judge finds that they totally disregard his order, Warren? Where do we stand legally when, and my guess is that's how he's going to find, because they knew when they did. That's why that guy tweeted, oops, too late. Yeah, right.
Well, that the guy that tweeted that was, let's say he was in El Salvador, whether he was a government official or not, whether he was a private contractor working for the government, I actually don't know.
Marco
But
Rubio retweeted it.
yeah, well,
Okay.
that's that I wasn't aware of, and
Yes, he did.
yeah, and I'm not disputing it or saying that is accurate. But if it is accurate, that's unfortunate. Let's put it that way. Um, but what is likely to happen? Well, I'll say one thing. The judge being pissed off, I think, had nothing to do with his decision, and I don't know if I'd characterize his motivation as being pissed off. I think he's acting in accord with conservative principles of jurisprudence with regard to giving a defendant an opportunity to be heard, requiring the other side to provide factual evidence. There's nothing unusual about that. I mean, that's the way the judiciary has always operated. And if the judge gives specific orders that are specifically evaded or actions are taken in contradiction to it, so that there's sufficient evidence to establish contempt, you would more than likely have a contempt hearing. And then if contempt is established, you'd have an appropriate remedy that would issue for the contempt violation. And then you're going to have a whole bunch of appeals at the end of all of this, which is eventually going to go up to the Supreme Court. And I think the administration is hoping that its conservative majority is going to support its efforts. But the extent to which they violated due process and the extent to which they've been contemptuous of the judicial machinery in the country and the Article 3 powers of judges that are established in the Constitution are really getting, way up and almost over the line, if not over the line. And I don't think it's likely that even the conservative Supreme Court would sanction and approve of some of the actions that have been taken by the administration.
That remains to be seen.
What are
Yeah.
what are the Article 3 powers provisions that the judges can fall back on?
Well, Article 3 vests the judicial power of the United States and the federal government and the Supreme Court. And then judicial review goes back to Marbury versus Madison. When James Madison was the Secretary of State, and Marbury at that time would receive a commission as a justice of the peace. And Madison, for political reasons, refused to give it to him. And it had something to do with the tension between an outgoing and an incoming administration. And it was established that the act pursuant to which the commission was withheld, which was, I believe, the Act of 1788, was unconstitutional, as opposed to going after the actions of the Secretary of State in his official capacity or individually. So the foundation was laid centuries ago for judicial review, primarily of statutory action. We haven't had a lot of case law in the particular kind of circumstances where you have a president issuing executive orders, and curiously enough, you're not even sure if some of the actions are actually authorized by executive orders.
Okay, and don't mean to interrupt, but this has been
But
so
do.
good, but we only have a minute left.
Can I just add a very quick point? One of the things they're using against Mahmoud Khalil is they're saying that when he applied for his green card, he left out information, and so therefore his application is void. Well, it turns out there's another immigrant to the United States who also falsified his green card. The immigrant had applied for a student visa, enters the United States, and never went to school. And that guy should be deported. And that is Elon Musk.
Oh,
And-
interesting.
And with that, we have
Interesting.
with that we have about 20 seconds left.
Well, look, we could discuss all these craziness, all this nonsense for another 2 hours or more. So, but Warren, I want to thank you for being with us. Alan, as usual, your historical context helps, and our usual trio behind all this. We all want to thank you for being here. This has been Media Watch. I'm your co-host, Eric Tait.
I'm Raymond Peterson.
Alan Singer.
Bob Anthony, catch up to us on YouTube at Media Watch EVT.
And thanks again, Warren Bennia, Esquire.
And
Friend,
thank you for
colleague.
the invitation.
We'll catch you the next time, folks. Stay safe.